Good evening and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Adina Merenlender. Also a big happy New Year's because this is our first event in 2022. So my name is Jamie Madsen. I'm the marketing and events coordinator here, and I just have a few items to touch on before I hand it over to Adina. So keep an eye on your chat box tonight. I will be using this to share information about tonight's title, discount codes, a couple polls that we'll have upcoming and other goodies. So just keep an eye out there. Additionally, the format will feature between 35 to 45 minutes of speaking and will then be followed by a live Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see an icon that says Q&A. Please go ahead and submit your questions and comments there rather than replying in the chat box. And now I'm excited to introduce tonight's author, Adina Merenlender. Adina is a cooperative extension specialist at Cal Berkeley and is an internationally recognized conservation biologist known for land use planning, watershed science, landscape connectivity, and naturalist and stewardship training. She started the California Naturalist Program, which to date has graduated over 4,000 certified California naturalists. She is with us tonight to discuss her newest book, Climate Stewardship, Taking Collective Action to Protect California. I'm really excited to hand it over to you, Adina. Why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Great. Thanks so much, Jamie, and everyone at Copperfields for the invitation. I really, really appreciate being able to talk to folks who visit local bookstores and support local bookstores. Super awesome. I am going to start to share my screen. I'm going to share a few slides with you. We're going to run a little poll, find out what you've been thinking about around climate change, and I'll do a bit of readings as well. So short little readings, because hopefully you'll just read the book yourself. So let's get started. I'm going to share the screen. If you see a little bit of fidgeting around, not worry, give me 1 minute to get it all sort of set up. Let's see. Oh, you know what? 1 second here. Let's see if we can get it. There we go. Now let's try that again. There we go. Okay. Back to Obi's slide. Thanks for your patience, y'all. All right. First, again, thanks for joining us this evening. And second, thanks, of course, to my co-author, Brendan Bueller, who helped write this book in a narrative style that we hope you'll find super easy to read and get through. And Obi Kaufman, who, you know, is just an amazing artist, an amazing thinker, thought leader in the environment in California, an incredible naturalist. And it's just a real pleasure to include his work in the book as well. I want to start with a land acknowledgement and just say that I'm actually calling in and zooming in from the Hopland Research and Extension Center, which first and foremost, we want to acknowledge with honor the Choctaw and Hopland people on whose traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands is where we work, educate, and learn, and whose historical and spiritual relationship with these lands continues to this day and beyond. And it's a big honor to be a neighbor with the Hopland Band and Pomo Indians and to work with them on various efforts. So here comes our interactive part. And if you're on a computer while listening to me, or even if you're on your phone and you're super tech savvy, we're going to go ahead and have you enter the link in the chat, which I think Jamie has put in there. And you just go ahead and click on that link. And then enter your answer to what are you or your community's experiencing that you believe is connected to climate change. And I'm going to start showing those results live. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and I'm going to come back to you with the results. Great. So great. I see them coming in, and I am going to share them as you enter them. Good. So I am actually seeing fires. Not surprising right now. Drought, which we are so grateful for the rain right now. Flooding, disaster, loss. So trees, climate solutions too, right? Of course, we're also having some tree mortality. So that's maybe what people are thinking about as well. Certainly the temperatures are changing. Not saying heat yet, but I bet I will. Yeah, future. I love that. Children, Indigenous traditions, culture. Really, really helpful. Good. Well, thank you, you guys. That looks pretty neat. I like seeing what are sort of on people's minds. Hesitancy. Yeah. And I am going to keep them coming. We can check back on that if we want. And I'm going to pop our slides back on and see if I can get it to behave a little faster this time. Go back to where we were. Thank you so much. I think we're going to touch on some of those things this evening. We're already there. Great. One of the things I like to do before I share a bit about what's in the book is to talk about the theory behind the book, perhaps because as a conservation scientist, it was a very different type of project for me. It really was an art science collaborative, both having Obi, but also having Brendan as a narrative writer. And some of the things that were kind of on our minds were in particular about communicating about climate change and some of the studies that have been done that are highly relevant to this topic. And I guess I want to say that's why it's very different from, for instance, previous books like the California Naturalist Handbook or some of the science writing that I do in the literature. We really work to show, not tell folks about climate change and things that can be done. There was an interesting study by a person named Palm and their colleagues where they actually presented to adults suggestions on what they should do to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And they're very directive, you know, like you should eat less meat and travel less and things like that. Or scientists say, and it didn't matter whether scientists said you should do these things or we're just telling you should do these things. People were more actually their willingness to do those things, and even disappointingly, their willingness to vote for candidates who would help with climate change and would advance climate change mitigation went down after they were told what to do. And so as Brendan would say, this is like telling people what to do or think is like nails on a chalkboard for a lot of people. There are probably parents out there who can relate to this in a big way. So anyway, that is why we're always sort of trying to show through illustration what can actually take place that would improve the situation. Narratives are actually read twice as long and the content is retained twice as much. So it's double likely to be retained and people just stay with the content twice as long. And I always say, with the exception of my husband, who seems to read scientific factual books without any trouble. But for most of us, if it's in a story format, we're just a lot more likely to stay with it. And we're a lot more likely to retain the information. In talking about climate change all too often, especially in the beginning of climate change communication, there were a lot of stories that related to places quite far from people's experience. So when the polls were coming out of the Yale climate communication studies, they're really revealing that people were like, climate change is going on somewhere else in some future time. Because I hear about it about the Arctic or other places, or maybe flooding in Southeast Asia. So worked really hard to do this place-based work. You know, California is such an amazing place of 10 bioregions, so many different types of communities, so much going on right here in our diversity of people and places and ecosystems, that it was also really important for us to have sort of a very, like, that was challenging enough, right? To get all some stories from different places in California and still make it relevant. But these are places that you may have been to or heard about or even live in. So it helps to make the information more relevant to people's identity, and that relates to who's telling the stories as well, sort of the trusted messenger concept that some of you are probably familiar with. So people are much more likely to sort of have ideas resonate if they can, if the person who's telling the story, the people that they're observing are showing them something or have a worldview they can relate to. And of course, this backfires a lot of times as we get into our silos. But nonetheless, it was very important to us to have a lot of different types of voices and different types of communities showing us what can be done so that a diverse group of readership can relate. And I'll just say that lastly, like the actions that we talk about in the book, we really focus on collective actions that are tangible and actionable by a lot of different people. So they're not just things that, like, only if you have a PhD in this energy field are you going to be able to do anything. We really worked on, you know, the accessible, tangible actions that are collective by nature. And this came, I think, my passion for collective community scale actions, particularly on the community scale and thinking about addressing climate change in a regional way, came from my time when I was recently in England in 2019 before the pandemic. I had the good fortune of being on a 6-month sabbatical in Cambridge, and there's a course being taught there that kind of focused on people's carbon footprint. You know, so you went into class and you're supposed to improve your, you know, reduce your footprint and address climate change. So it was really about addressing climate change, but it was very focused on individual behaviors. And when I talked to some of my friends and colleagues who attended this class, because I was helping to design our UC Climate Stewards course, the folks that I was listening to were saying, I just felt completely depressed, discouraged by this class, you know, and we were really like, we don't want to design a course that people are just going to leave completely feeling inadequate, like, to address this problem. And in part, I think we can all relate to that, you know, even with sort of our best intentions to walk the talk. There'll be times when I myself, I know, will buy something and bring it home and didn't realize there was all this packaging associated, and I didn't, you know, put that all together, and I get sort of frustrated and depressed. And so really, individual actions can be tricky and can often make people feel like they're never doing enough. Whereas there's just so much, like, positive joy in working with others in the community. And I also, you know, believe that that's where the transformation really takes place, because it's really at the scale that makes big change. So my example of this is usually some people can put solar panels on their roofs, and that's great if you can. But, you know, everyone can join and help with community choice aggregated clean energy. And that's really where the transformation takes place. So we're very focused on these sort of community scale actions. I lastly want to say that sometimes when I do that poll, people will say things like they're frustrated or not enough's happening, or it's been too long since we've taken you know, not we, but that action has been taken to mitigate climate change. And that's absolutely true, right? Like, we actually know now that we can't actually leave this up to nation states. If we could have, we wouldn't be on the Conference of Parties or COP26, right? We wouldn't be looking at this many Conference of Party meetings, and we wouldn't be having this sort of vague guidelines that, you know, where the action is really been missing. So I think that this is also important, that communities can take action, regional action can be collective and add up to very transformative actions. And also that the people sort of show sometimes their nation states what they expect, right? So you can realize it for your own community. And, you know, Marin is just an amazing example of realizing a lot of climate mitigation through Marin Drawdown and other activities that you have in your county planning and city plannings to show everyone, look, this is where we need to go. This is what we're going to do, regardless of what the rhetoric is at the nation state level. It's always hard to choose what stories to share with an audience from Climate Stewardship, because we have over 70 stories in the book and from different ecosystems and things. But I thought I would just talk a little bit about wetland restoration with you, because it has so many win-win-wins, and because the story comes from very close to the Marin County area in the North Bay. We decided to talk about Highway 37 from Novato to Vallejo, because it's a place that the public can drive along and see wetlands and experience firsthand, unfortunately, some of the road closures that are caused by surges and king tides and the flooding and sea level rise. And in fact, some of you may recall that in 2016-17, that road was closed for about 28 days. So this is really a confluence of forces that are, being exacerbated by climate change. So it's having a real climate change having a multiplicative effect on what's happening in this part. And actually there's some changes that are being proposed right now for this area. So, and also it's king tide season. So I thought, well, we should talk a little bit about what happens when you hit El Nino with king tides and you have a road and you don't have enough wetlands. The other thing is that restoring wetlands provides so many benefits, both, to our infrastructure, as well as to ecosystems, as well as to mitigating climate change. So, and dealing with carbon sequestration. So they're natural filters, right? So we get to trap some of the contaminants that are running off from the uplands into the bay. So that's protecting our water quality. They're buffering sea level rise and flood protection. So if you can put the infrastructure behind wetlands, you get the advantage of having that buffer of protection. They soak up water like a sponge, right? So they're a great absorber of high tides, and they slow the surface flows. They're also, as many of you can appreciate, I think, the important habitat that they provide for plants and animals. What always surprises me is that they sequester more carbon per acre than forests. So if they're left undisturbed and we're not sort of tilling them and farming them, which would release the carbon, then they do sequester quite a lot of carbon dioxide, which is super important. And that kind of carbon dioxide gets submerged into the salty deep water where not a lot of aerobic activity happens in that salty anaerobic environment. And that's where the carbon sort of stays down below surface in those roots and plant tissue. And it's just packed full of plant tissue. I know some of you are probably already thinking wetland smell, and it's partly because of methane. And so yes, wetlands can release some methane, which is a short-lived greenhouse gas, but is a powerful greenhouse gas that can be heat trapping. And that in part does have to do with how we manage those wetlands. So wetlands are a complicated story, but I think they're very, very important, have many, many benefits. And we've also seen and I know you have in your neighborhoods, this tremendous amount of sort of resurgence of wetland restoration. And we need to see that, since about over 90% of the wetlands in California have been modified and converted and lost their function. Okay, looks like we went through all of that. The people part, which is really important. So how are these wetlands getting restored? Some of you may have heard of this awesome program called STRAW. I know there's a program in Northern Marin, I think in San Rafael, there's a site. There are many sites in the North Bay. This has been going on, thanks to Point Blue, and Loretta Rogers, who's here in the middle, started this program when she was a school teacher. And she's brought these fourth graders out, and now there's lots of kids involved and lots of teachers involved, and she's gone on to be a very important coordinator of this effort. It also involves private lands. We know that these lowlands in California are mostly privately owned. So we have a rancher on the bottom right here, who's a really key figure in getting these efforts going. And since 1992, this program, just STRAW itself, has over 650 restoration projects, over 40 miles of creek bank restoration and wetland restoration in partnership with local landowners, business, government agencies. Lots of folks are involved. And all the plants they use are natives. And the other really interesting thing that we talk about in the book is the planting palette. Which plants are they using and why? And Point Blue has worked really hard to have these climate-wise planting palettes. So what will be more resilient into the future given climate change? So a lot has sort of, in a sense, budded off from this program. The WHO also includes incredible community efforts by Latino outdoors. And here we have Veronica Miranda, who I spoke to, who organizes family outings for people and did a really neat camp out at Richardson Bay where they were working on trails and camping and looking at creatures and critters and observing nature together. The key to successful community building, she says, is making sure you create a safe place, an inclusion of everyone, regardless of what they're called or where they come from or their age. It's, you're a human being, come join us. And it's with that spirit that she really makes people feel included and connected to nature and to the service of contributing to its restoration. There obviously is this push, and some of you may be already participating in this in the Marin area to regenerate living shorelines. So this relates, of course, to sea level rise and how we're going to adapt to what's coming. There we will see a certain amount of sea level rise emerge. Just based on the amount of carbon dioxide that we've already put into the atmosphere. So this is something we have to get ready, even if we were to stop all fossil fuel burning tomorrow, we still need to get ready for some sea level rise and some interaction between that and the king tides in our coastal communities. And they're really suffering the most damage, as I said, is there's storm waves, high tides, El Nino years. That's when we see some pretty devastating effects on our coastlines. So living shorelines are made in natural materials, provide habitat, increase resilience for nearshore communities, which is super important. And the idea, and I think it's been interesting to look at some of the modeling and forecasting of how these shorelines can grow, mature, and continue to increase the adaptive capacity that they provide over time. So starting now is super beneficial because they'll become more and more mature and more add more and more resilience as they go on. It's sort of like anybody who's planted a garden, you sort of plant your garden, you're so glad you planted those fruit trees when your kids were little because now they're off at college and they're bearing all this fruit and things like that. So it's just, it takes time for these communities to mature and produce what we're looking for. I'll just read the quote by Laura, who's a real expert in this area. It's about creating living, thriving, resilient systems that evolve over time. No one size fits all, and that's a challenge. And that kind of brings up what you're faced with, some of the really neat strategies that seem to be going on in Marin, and you all are much more experts than me on this. But as you know, the Bay Area is going to be seeing quite a bit of sea level rise. A great model that we talk a little bit about in the book too, called Cosmos, is there to look at in what years, how much inundation is likely to occur in some of these baylands. And I was pleased to see that Leslie Lacko, and I'm sure others in Marin County, are presenting to communities through a participatory approach some different scenarios and alternatives. And I saw the report on Stinson Beach. I know there's a couple of other spots. So that's a great place to get involved and see what options are available. I know for some people it may seem like what's taking us so long, but these are fairly major projects, and it's always great to see public-private sector coming together with the resources to get this thing going. So I was excited to find that online. I'm going to talk a little bit about habitat connectivity and wildlife corridors, because this is the primary adaptation strategy for wildlife conservation under climate change. It's very interesting. We don't really come up with very many ways in which we can assist non-human species to survive the changes that human species have created. And one of them is to improve the connectivity or the permeability of our landscapes, and to sometimes put in those corridors to facilitate their movement. And we tend to think about habitat corridors historically for basically dealing with habitat fragmentation. So how do we connect patches of habitat that we have fragmented due to development? But more and more now we're thinking about these yellow boxes, the facilitated range shifts that we see here, because under climate change, species are likely to, many will have to move to adapt and change where they live so that they can move mostly to cooler climes or moister climes. And for that reason, this topic of where to put linkages and how to deal with habitat connectivity is really on the rise, given climate change, as well as the traditional problems that we're facing with habitat protection. I just want to mention the power of community vision. We did actually a whole paper and study on what is it that allows us to implement corridor conservation. So there's one thing behind the sort of study of corridors and identifying corridors, and then another is how do you get them done? One of the primary key things that has to be in place for all the people we interviewed who got corridors done on the ground and protected was a common community vision. Super, super important. And we see that really active in Coyote Valley, south of San Jose. And that's why, yes, there are agencies, amazing agencies of open space districts and things like that, but there are citizens who care about Coyote Valley. And Susan Butler Graham is one of them. She works with Mothers Out Front. She volunteers. It's a mother's climate action group that's national. And when I interviewed her, she said, before I joined the group, I would get panicked, and then I would go into denial because I could not sustain that level of anger and sadness and worry about what am I going to say to my kids in 10 years. Joining a group is essential. Then you get fortified, hearing about what other moms are doing. It's contagious. Now I don't have to go into denial and shut down. I can say, yes, this is horrible. And yes, this is scary, but I'm doing everything I can. And she talks about how they prioritize their topics. They get together at the beginning of the year, evaluate how things went. They go to trainings and all kinds of things, but they also pick their projects or campaigns for the year. And she said that the Coyote Valley corridor came up because it seems so urgent, like time sensitive, that if they didn't protect Coyote Valley, it would soon be paved over like the rest of Silicon Valley. They wouldn't have that opportunity anymore. So they really jumped on a Coyote project. And here we see the linkage that Coyote Valley provides between the coastal ranges and the Diablo ranges to the east. And it's just one of the last sort of open space, agricultural open space areas between these two large mountain ranges. They actually took advantage of Mother's Day, and they ended up getting community members to sign postcards, and they delivered 500 postcards to the city council on Mother's Day, arguing for protecting Coyote Valley. And they were able to get the city council to contribute 93 million to the deal. And since then, there have been other fairly major contributions to this effort. But I love that idea that moms are out there collecting postcards and giving them to their decision makers on Mother's Day to argue for Coyote Valley protection. And I'm just looking at the clock here, see how we're doing. We're all right. I'm just close with a little bit about food. Most of us in the North Bay, anyway, I know we're mostly foodies. We love our food, and it tastes so good living in a Mediterranean climate. But of course, getting involved with food is really critical, is a real critical climate action, because agriculture contributes 10% to the US greenhouse gas emissions, right? So things that we can do in that sector are going to be super positive for climate mitigation and adaptation. And organic waste contributes to methane. So we really want to eliminate food waste. We really don't want that to be just rotting and contributing to our methane problem. And it turns out that 58 million pounds is estimated of food rots in the country's fields. So there's a lot just rotting right around. I think when I first came to doing research for this book, I thought about the plate scrape in the restaurant. I thought about grocery stores. I didn't really think as much about what's not, making it even out of the farm. So all of those things are relevant. And there's something called a food recovery hierarchy. It's a little bit dry, like most things that the federal government comes out to teach people about these things, but I found it useful, just trying to reduce at the source. So that's right at the farm, right? And then, what to do with the food, feed hungry people first, feed animals next, industrial uses like gas generation, other kinds of energy, fuel. And then, of course, composting, which I know many people do in their own homes, and communities and community gardens. And then lastly, we want to see it go into the landfill. But I think it's important to know how far down composting is. So there's a lot we can do before we compost food. And I really learned a lot from Jennifer Coteron, who's a master gardener, master food preserver, amazing community organizer who started by organizing school gardens and ended up by organizing something called Gleam Slow. And she talks about how much water and labor has gone into producing that fruit or vegetable. And there are so many people hungry in our community. It's important to nurture the health of the entire community. And I know there's like Marin Organics. I don't know how much gleaning goes on in your communities, but this is a really, rich place to get involved. Just checking on that reading. And so they harvest it, redistribute it. Some of it goes to food banks, some of it goes to school kitchens, that kind of thing. And I also thought it was interesting how they originally thought about this problem much more from gardens. It was just like overflowing gardens because she was a master gardener and everybody's producing too much in their own home gardens. And then they expanded from gleaning home gardens to gleaning with farmers. And the combination produces quite a lot of food. This is Ava Posco, and where I'm going to close out with you. Ava Posco works in Watts, and as she says, in Watts, people don't have a lot of access to fresh food and vegetables. They're suffering from health problems that are caused by food environment. For those of you who don't know, Watts is in East Los Angeles. Ava Posco is the Mudtown Farm Coordinator and works with the Watts Labor Community Action Committee team. She actually is on their staff, but she coordinates huge numbers of volunteers to make this whole thing happen. And with that, I think I'll just do a short reading so you can get a little bit of the style of the book related to Ava and her work. In underserved urban communities, the lack of food sovereignty is a public health crisis. As part of the Watts Rising effort, Ava Posco works to create neighborhood gardens on an impressive scale. She says, there is not a lot of greenery out here and every little bit counts. Watts Rising has an anti-displacement working group, but Posco says there's no guarantee. Will the people here be able to enjoy the benefits, or does it just increase the rent and push people out? Nobody has a real answer to these things, and I don't even have an answer either, she said. Engaging community members in growing their own local fresh food ties all three focal areas of Watts Rising together: environmental, economic, and health. Growing food and other plants are two of the goals of Mudtown Farms, a program of Watts Labor Community Action Committee, which is next to the Jordan Downs housing complex. Posco is the Mudtown Farms program coordinator. She grew up in New York and with two cultures, Chinese and North American. She says, being biracial, I feel like I'm stuck in two worlds. So I see racism around me and it happens to me. But I also pass because people don't know what ethnicity I am. So they make people feel they have a pass to be racist around me. Posco says, I am not seen as fully one or the other, but I'm both. I'm me and I'm an American, just trying to do what's best for everyone. And she's really quite an expert on soil remediation and gardening. I mean, incredible regenerative agriculture expert. And I like in the end, and she said, maybe if I can remediate 50 yards, other people will want to do the same thing. I think it starts one plot at a time. And I think that's true for so many things. I mean, what doesn't start one project at a time? So lastly, I first really want to say that I started with community scale action. And I really believe that bookstores like Copperfields create community. So one of the actions that you can take is buy all your books from Copperfields, buy books from your local bookstores. They've really saved me during the pandemic to go to my local bookstore and grab extra reading since I have more downtime. And I'm sure everyone on this call feels the same way. To close out, before I pop back to Jamie for some questions, I'll read a little bit from In the End. So the whole book, we kicked the book off with a preface and an amazing sort of foreword by Greg Saris of dreams that Mabel McKay, his ancestors, had in Indigenous dreaming. And then it's all showing you what folks are doing and weaving climate science in between in a way that we hope makes it easy to digest the climate science. And then we close out with our own little In the End. And of course, remember, we wrote the book during the pandemic, so it's reflected in this. Anyway, so to close from the end, environmental and social contexts vary widely across California, and so too the actions shared in this book. Local communities are best suited to identify, design, and implement what is needed to improve community and ecosystem resilience. The actors in the book draw on different life experiences and perspectives and express different ways of knowing their environment and society. They bring their whole person to the effort and come up with personal touches based on what sticks and helps people stay engaged, such as naming trees as they're planted or making it fun, like fishing in the Los Angeles River. Joy comes from connecting with others in a purposeful way that transcends self. Working together, we can make California resilient and experience lasting joy. That joy can help give hope to the larger challenge climate change presents. Maybe the most important lesson that the present catastrophes can teach us is this: we are not powerless, and we must work together to save the Earth, our only home. With that, I'll pass it back to Jamie and find out if there's some questions.
What a beautiful and compelling share. I really appreciate that. And to all of you watching, we do have one or two questions, but we have plenty of time if you want to continue to submit. Okay, so let's start with Kobe. I am perpetually bothered by all the fruit that remains on the trees or lays on the ground unharvested. Definitely want to know how to address this via gleaning, etc. Hoping to learn how to get this food into the hands of people who need fresh fruits.
Yeah, right on, Kobe. I did kind of like sometimes before I come on, I try and find a little bit about the communities that I'm entering, even in a Zoom space. And I know that I saw an article around something called Marin Organics, and they seem to be mentioning gleaning. But then when I went to the Marin Organics website, I came out empty. So that might be something that you could take on, is find out who is glean. I always like to start with an existing group. There's some gleaners, and maybe someone even in this audience knows some gleaners in Marin. There are gleaners in Sonoma County. There's an active gleaners group way up in Willits. So like there are gleaners groups. If you don't find one, I would say definitely start one. And sometimes you can build it off of like the master gardeners or master food preservers, which you have through cooperative extension. Or you also have, let's say, like Drawdown Marin. So I would suggest if there isn't a gleaning group already, but you're interested in gleaning, think about either a climate action group that exists, just so because it's sometimes easier to tear up their sort of community capacity and then say, hey, we want to have a committee that's going to run around and glean. Often those groups are connected with their local food banks. So check your food banks. They're probably bringing in a lot of food from supermarket food waste, to prevent supermarket food waste, but they also may have a way in which they take donations, and that is often true. So the gleaners are really just the middle people, the workers between the fruit that's falling and the food bank, and also school gardens. So I hope that helps a little bit. I'm sorry I don't have like the precise answer for you to go to in Marin, but those are the organizations that tend to connect gleaners to the food stream. And the other thing that Jennifer said is she's run a lot of volunteer organizations, and she said it is the easiest thing for her to get volunteers for is gleaning, because everybody leaves with like an extra bag of lemons. I mean, inevitably you get food when you go gleaning for yourself. And so the food preservers are a great group who love gleaning because they want to make jams and jellies and other things. So I hope it works, and keep me posted because I'm super into it too. And I'm thinking my next sabbatical is going to be gleaning and preserving.
That's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that. Yeah, Kobe says, thanks, Adina. So we have another question. Can you talk about any state or federal policies that could or do help fund these important projects, or policies you'd like to see do this?
Yeah. And in fact, that's kind of how I found a lot of the stories. So I definitely recommend throughout the book, we mentioned various grant programs and ways and people, how they got resourced for the work that they're doing. So for instance, a lot of the agricultural programs that we talk about and interview folks receive sweep grants. So there's a big CalCan, which is actually, I think the main office might be in Marin. So you guys are like the headquarters for climate change, agricultural group. So throughout the book, there's too many to even mention, but we talk about groups that, fund particularly urban, low-income housing on vulnerable communities who are, on the frontline community grants. There are many of those out of the state. We talk about agricultural support system, funding, and also about shoreline, and even about education and community. So throughout, we try to acknowledge the funding sources, and we hope that's helpful to people who are kind of looking for that. Jamie, you're on mute.
Thanks so much. Okay. Rara is wondering, thanks for the land acknowledgement, Adina. I'd also like to honor my ancestors and the ancestors from the lands you and I are standing. Would you please share the most interesting wisdom on climate justice you gained from the Indigenous people?
Wow, it just keeps growing for me. I'm so glad you asked, because it's just been like, I'm on this steep learning curve and I'm in the early phases, but I have to thank, Don Hankins and Mary Adisella and many, many people, Alicia Cordero, many people mentioned in the book, Greg Saris and stuff, just Indigenous leaders in traditional ecological knowledge and stewardship for sort of sharing their stories. Of course, there's a lot going on in Indigenous fire, right? And in good fire. And I didn't talk about the fire stories. It's how we start the book, but mostly because I feel like that's something that you all might be sort of steeped in based on your experiences in the North Bay. So anyway, there's obviously a lot of traction around that. I'm sort of interested, actually, because that's such a space that a lot of people are working in good fire and Indigenous burning and cultural burning. I've sort of been interested in working with people on other stewardship activities around like non-timber harvest projects. So basically, foods and medicines and other things that people need to tend and harvest and use, including, of course, acorn. But I want to say that the most fun for me was talking to a couple of young Indigenous men down in Southern California who have an organic olive production farm they're put in place, but they also do a lot of other organic farming on the Luiseño Indians. And that was so interesting to me. They did get a sweep grant, so they got state money to help put in this organic olives, and it's an area which traditionally doesn't grow olives, and they got a corporate olive grower interested to sort of mentor the process of growing olives and to purchase the first crops, because you know how it's hard when you're first farming to make sure somebody's going to buy this stuff and get it into oil. And they got cooperation from the private sector, they got cooperation from the public sector, but mostly like tons of sweat equity by these young folks to put in the farm. And then they have lots of education for their youth in and around the farm and the gardens that they've created. So they have native hedgerows, lots of diversified farming practice, lots of sustainable farming practices in and around these olives and other citrus that they grow and other things they grow. They're all organic, and they also have native plants and gardens that are labeled with the indigenous languages. So there's just a lot going on with youth ed, with the olives, with other parts of the farm that they're doing. I just was really impressed, and they were so young and energetic. And that's so hard on our indigenous communities. The passing on of knowledge and indigenous education is, they've been so disrupted that it was great to see these 20-something guys, all in and helping the indigenous education programming, but also entrepreneurial and economic sustainability and workforce. So lots more to do on that front. Any ways, that we can uplift and help. I think it's an exciting direction for California communities.
What a great story. Sort of to pivot, how did you decide on the stories? How did you gather your research? What was that process like?
Yeah, right. There's a lot going on in California. It's such a awesome place.
How do you even decide?
Which is really fun because, I feel like we are in some ways leading some of the ways. And not that we don't have to learn from other folks too, but, it is a neat place to be living and working on the topic. It was interesting because we were so aware of this thing of like, who are the messengers, right? So we had this giant, crazy, multi-dimensional matrix and basically a giant spreadsheet, but it had like all these topics we needed to cover, these ecosystems that we needed to address. So topics meaning like climate actions, and then there were ecosystems, and then there's like the voices, and then there's youth and adult and, moms and indigenous people and, sort of like, Black scientists, Black history, Asian immigrants, like there's so much, we have Hmong farmers, so it was always like this idea of like, you can't do everything. There's a lot on the cutting room floor, and that's always really hard, especially when you've written those stories and they don't, make it in because you want to keep it short and sweet and digestible. But just to say that it was this crazy matrix where we were trying to kind of like, and then lastly, trying to find the voices of actually, with a preference toward, not to say volunteer in the sense that we're anti-work, but to say volunteer in the sense of approachable to anyone to be able to do this. So some of the voices have to be just regular folks, and maybe they were trained in something totally different and now they're doing this. And so that actually is that extra leap, because professionals tend to be on LinkedIn with a full profile and they're happy to talk to you and they're being paid to talk to you, and it's this whole other thing of digging. And fortunately, Elizabeth Archer helped us a lot with that, to do that research. So it's like, you have to dig into the community to find the people that are just like, I'm a weed warrior and I volunteer every weekend. Like how do you, so we sometimes won't go to the volunteer coordinator of organization. What can we talk to somebody who, volunteers for you? So sometimes there's many steps. And definitely it's not all there. What can you say, except for we did try to kind of weave our way around. And then there's geography lastly, right? And bioregions, so you can't have everything from the conifer belt. It's a desert, so we're hopping around the state, and
That's incredibly interesting. What was it like to write a book during the pandemic?
Oh yeah. I really want to find, I'm going to try really quickly to find that quote from Brendan, because
especially with all, the people who were helping you, and was everything just via email and over like Skype calls?
Right. So Brendan wrote this toward the end. I mean, we wrote it together, but he's the funny guy. So if you laugh, we try to make you laugh a little in the book, because if you're not laughing, you're crying about climate change. So it's like,
right.
You need that sort of like release. So he says, we don't bring this up to say, we talk a little bit, the paragraph before, about, we say in 2020, the world well ended. It's probably too strong. By the summer 2020, as we write this, the number of reported COVID. So the first paragraph acknowledges that this is the time of the pandemic. And then he goes on to say, cities and states, as we're writing, cities and states are lurching back into various stages of shutdowns. In-person instruction in the fall looks unlikely. The economy is walking in circles with foam on its lips, and who knows what fall and winter will bring. Best case scenario, you're reading this book while recovering from a live concert or using the treadmill at the gym. Worst case, you're reading these pages as you feed them into a small fire in a cave. We don't bring this up to say that it's hard to write stories of climate optimism during a global pandemic, although it can feel like trying to floss your teeth while standing behind an incontinent hippopotamus. We bring it up because climate change and global pandemic have much in common, and we were warned about both well in advance. And with both crises, experts said that it was not a matter of if they'd happen, but rather a question of how bad they'd be. And the answer to that question is up to us.
What a wonderful quote.
So
Really
there we are in our bathrooms with trying to floss our teeth behind an incontinent hippopotamus is the way Brendan felt about it.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I admire that. I mean, to get that all done during the pandemic must have been challenging. So
yeah, no, I mean, really, it's all the people who are willing to get on Zoom. In some cases, we probably found them, in their living rooms going, I guess I do have time to talk.
Yeah.
Not going anywhere.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's end on one final question, which is a perfect question. Cynthia is interested in the Climate Steward program, and she is wondering if you can talk more about that, any, more information, details.
Absolutely. I can't believe I didn't have the link at the ready. So I'm going to do that. The number of classes are growing. The geography is growing.
That is so exciting. What a wonderful program that you put together.
Well, yeah, it's been great. I'm definitely excited to be on the core team. I work with the director of the California Naturalist Program, Greg Ira, and our coordinator for Climate Steward, Sarah Mae Nelson.
Nice.
And also on the California Naturalist website, so just Google California Naturalist, you can go under take a class, and you'll see all the calendar courses that are coming up. If you're a California Naturalist, it is a different format. It's kind of a hybrid format with some in-person discussion and a lot of online videos and modules. That kind of helps us keep the content knowledge fresh because climate change and climate science move fast. Mm-hmm. And then the book sort of supports the California climate change story and context and helps people to imagine what they'd like to do as part of their capstone and service. We're just about to launch it with all of the Climate Corps members that Gavin Newsom set up. So that's fun for us to work with young people. We're working with workforce education, with the CES, the California Conservation Corps, with California Naturalists, and hopefully Climate Stewards soon. So
what a great way. Yeah, it's such a great way too to meet other people in your area, and you can start like a gleaning group or
exactly. Yeah, that's kind of the idea. And they do a community assessment of resilience. So it's very place-based, and that's thanks to our partners. So we have, over 50 local organizations offer California Naturalist and then can offer climate stewards, and they're across the state. And that's where it happens. So we coordinate it through cooperative extension, but really it's these local organizations like Point Reyes, National Seashore, and other association that offer California Natural. So there's organizations all around the state that are offering these programs, including community colleges and CCC programs. And we're there to support them.
Oh, wonderful. And so will locations be on that website? Kobe is wondering about Pepperwood. So
yes, Pepperwood has already offered a course. They may have offered two already. So they're on a roll. Definitely an awesome location for climate stewards and CalNat. Sonoma Ecology Center, which isn't that far from you guys, in Sonoma, the town of Sonoma. So that's closer to Marin than Santa Rosa. And depending where you are, but anyway, it's pretty close. And they have like a few openings left. So if you want to take that course starting at the end of January, definitely jump on that at the Sonoma Ecology Center. But also just check out our website on Climate Stewards and it'll reveal that course as well as others.
This has been so fascinating and informative. I really want to thank you for being with us tonight. Just to reiterate, many people are typing in thank you, and they're so, stoked that we had, an event with you because they wanted to hear more. To all of you asking, yes, this is being recorded. You will all receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording, and I'll include all the links from tonight that we shared, including the book and the discount code, as well as the California Naturalist. So if you just watched, no problem. We've got you covered. And Adina, thank you so much for being with us.
It's been my pleasure, Jamie, and I really appreciate everyone. And like I said, Copperfields and local book buying and supporting community scale economies and all other community scale actions that you all are participating in. It's really making a difference. So
it's great. Hopefully we'll get you in person real soon when they go back.
I always love being in Marin, so that would be fun. Right, guys, and thanks for being great. I wish we were in person together, but it'll happen. We'll get there.
Yes. Thanks so much, Dina. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.